Hello, beautiful faces. My name is Stephanie Edmonds. Welcome to Teaching Liberty. To live free, you have to think free. And today I'm going to ask you to look at the world through the perspective of Palestinian American Jenin Younes. Jenin is a civil liberties attorney whose work I became familiar with during the COVID pandemic, fighting against lockdowns and mandates. It has now been nearly 7 months since Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. And in the time since, we've seen Israel's unrelenting response, which has led to upwards of 40,000 deaths, the majority of which are innocent civilians, and 2/3 of which are women and children. While most of us have Jewish friends, and we are all exposed to the pro-Israel perspective on mainstream media, most of us have never met a Palestinian, and we don't often get to hear from that perspective. I asked Jenin to come on to share both her personal story about growing up as a Palestinian American and hearing the stories of her father's experiences in the West Bank, and also to help us break down the free speech First Amendment issues, particularly as they concern the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is currently making its way through Congress. This is one of the most important podcasts I've done in a long time, so make sure you've hit that like button, leave us a comment down below to let us know your thoughts, and share this with your friends. I'm willing to bet most of them have never met a Palestinian American, let alone thought about the conflict through their eyes. Hi, Jenin. Thanks so much for joining me today in this particularly contentious time in this country, and a particularly contentious moment in the past 6 months that we're having here domestically. And I think that your perspective is particularly important, not only because you are a civil rights attorney, but you are also a Palestinian American. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So we have a lot I want to get into, but I just wanted to start by asking you to share your story of your family, the stories that you heard growing up, and how that's informed your practice as a civil liberties attorney.
My father was born in what's now the West Bank. It was at the time Jordan in 1952. So that fell under Israeli control in 1967. When Israel took over parts of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. And I heard a lot of stories about what that was like from my father when I was growing up. In fact, one of the reasons he decided to come to the West was because living under the Israeli occupation was pretty much hell. There's no freedom of movement. The Israelis sort of control your every move. If you want to go to the next town, you have to go through checkpoints. Sometimes they can just not let you through for any reason, no reason. They don't like how you look. They don't like what you're wearing. He has all sorts of stories. I don't remember the details at the moment, but like some were his brothers who traveled abroad and then were never, usually to other countries in the Arab world, and then were just never allowed back. So like they were never able to come back to the West Bank. They were like stuck in Jordan forever. Never got to see their mother again. Lots of sort of economic limitations. So it's difficult to work in Israel. You had to get a permit, but then Israel had like a kind of stranglehold on what the Palestinians could actually do, export. So just life is very, very difficult. That's not even the violence. So because the West Bank is controlled by Israel militarily, there are constant situations where the soldiers beat up Palestinians, imprison them. You don't have due process rights. You have no rights. So you don't have rights under a Palestinian government or Israeli. So you can be sent to prison for any reason or no reason at all. Again, children sent to prison lots of times, sometimes, for very minor things like throwing a stick at an Israeli soldier, or, even something less like saying a bad word. So it's just a very, very, it's a very oppressive condition to grow up in. And I don't think most Americans understand that. And I never want to say terrorism is never excusable. I want to caveat everything I say with that. Killing innocent people is never excusable, but I think you can understand why people in that situation would feel some frustration. So anyway, my father was born to peasants who were actually illiterate, and he grew up very, very poor, but he saw an education as his only way out of this. So he somehow managed to get to the University of Jordan, got a bachelor's degree, and then got a scholarship to study linguistics at UT in Austin, which is where he met my mother, who is in the same program. So both my parents are linguists. And he frankly had a huge chip on his shoulder. Like my entire childhood was kind of like, when I think about it, it was mainly him telling stories about the oppressive conditions in which he grew up. And I remember when Yitzhak Rabin was about to reach a peace deal, and we were close to a two-state solution, but then Rabin was killed by a right-wing extremist in Israel who didn't want a two-state solution, and everything fell apart, and it never came, it never got anything close to a two-state solution. And my dad was just like so sad. So
And that's when Netanyahu really rose to power.
yeah, yeah. And of course, things have really only been worse since then.
Yeah, I remember we've actually had the opportunity to meet before. I became aware of your work during the pandemic, when you were standing up for the civil liberties of businesses, of kids, standing against the mandates. And one of the things that I always remember you saying, because I was like, wow, you're tall. And you're like, yeah, actually, but both of my parents are short, right? And you're like, well, or my father is short, and likely because growing up, he didn't have access to the most nutritional food, right? Or
Yeah,
to the proper amount of nutrition.
yeah,
And I just think that's very reflective of the conditions that he had to grow up in. And yeah, so hearing these stories growing up, I imagine they had an impact on the way you saw the world, the way that you view being an American, and the line of work that you do. So, can you talk a little bit about how hearing these stories and the experience of your family has been passed down to you, and how you've internalized that and moved through the world as an American?
yeah. I mean, I think there's a pretty direct connection. So, I mean, hearing these stories about how a government or a force that Palestinians didn't even elect essentially controls their lives makes me very wary of big government and sort of like unconstitutional action that's taken without following the rules. Like the separation of powers. I mean, so my dad's circumstances certainly led me to be interested in constitutional law and preserving people's individual rights, because I think that's so important.
The past 6 months, there's been a lot of changes. I know for me, I became aware of the Palestinian, Israeli conflict in 2009. I went to Israel. I stayed there for about 4 months. I did tourist things. I worked and lived on a kibbutz for some of the time, and I just coincidentally had the opportunity to go to the West Bank. I went one time at the beginning of my trip just for a day trip, and I stayed connected with the person who gave us the tour, and I went back and I stayed for several days. And I experienced firsthand many of the things that you described, from the checkpoints all over the place, to random checkpoints, to just being pulled over and asked to show papers. And um, one of the days, too, when I had gone back and stayed, we just couldn't leave the house because they had decided to put up a checkpoint for basically, I was explained, for basically no good reason. They just felt like it. At least that's the perspective, right, of the Palestinians. And then when we went through the pandemic and we had the lockdowns and the
Yeah,
school closures, I was activated. I felt very suppressed. I felt like my civil liberties were being
yeah,
denied. And it very much reminded me of, I could only imagine if that was my life every single day, for my
Yeah.
whole life and not just this short period of time.
Yeah.
And so what has it been like these past 6 months in particular? How have you seen things, the conversation change in the United States generally? And then I kind of want to focus in on the what I saw is developing as this like anti-woke freedom movement. Like I had all this optimism, like, oh, there's this great group of people who really understands the oppressiveness of too much centralized government power. They're speaking up against the weaponization of the government to put all these new like social norms in and changing our education system. And then it just felt like 10/7, everything just like flipped and that whole coalition just splintered. So yeah, if you
Yeah.
can tell me generally and then narrow in on this more specific issue.
Frankly, I feel like nothing's been the same since 10/7, and it's a bit how I felt. Like there are these weird parallels with like March 2020, where I, as sort of lefty leaning civil libertarian, when I opposed COVID restrictions and ended up, writing for sort of right leaning publications, libertarian publications, all my lefty friends were really mad at me and were like, "You're a terrible person. You want grandma to die," and also, even if you don't, working with these right-wing people is like, is just unacceptable, and etc. And so I had to make all these new friends, and we formed this group, and I felt really, I mean, this is like a term I hate to use because it has so many bad connotations, but let's say like safe. Like I felt like I had this group who like shared my values and understood, and then 10/7 just blew that all apart. Incidentally, I was at my father's house, which is just a huge coincidence because I don't see him all that often, but I happened to be there. I like remember exactly. I came down for breakfast, and he was like, "Hamas took hostages in Israel," and I was kind of like, "Oh, whatever." There's always like stuff going on in Gaza. I thought maybe like they took 2 soldiers or something. I didn't pay that much attention, and then as soon as I looked at Twitter, I was like, "Oh my god!" And then as I looked at it more, and all the people who I thought I was friends with were saying the most heinous things immediately, just like, um, just raise them all, kill them all. Raise as in RAZE, raise Gaza, kill them all. They're all terrorists. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, what happened on October 7th was horrible. It was unacceptable. I would never in a million years defend it. I think Hamas is a terrorist organization, and I don't support it in any way. But like, you can't immediately call for the annihilation of 2 million people based on their ethnic connection to that group. That's okay. These are rational people. Maybe they're upset, but like, if I make these points, surely they'll listen. And that wasn't like that at all. They were just anger, racist stuff. So I actually went off Twitter for a while. I was like, I can't deal with this. It was making me really upset. I mean, to see these things said about your people. And then once Israel, and I don't think it was the most tasteful thing to go out on October 8th and march for Palestine. I didn't participate in such a protest. But on the other hand, the reason people did it was because anyone who'd been observing the behavior of Israel under the Netanyahu government knew what they were going to do. We knew that they were going to go and kill a lot of civilians because that's how they operate. So, and then once that started happening and the killing started to get really intense and the calls to continue intensifying it, and then there were people from our group who are saying it's anti-Semitic to say there should be a ceasefire. I mean, that's crazy. Like, that's completely crazy. But anyway, okay, so that was, so I felt a little bit like I lived through a redux of spring 2020, where I had to sort of regroup. And eventually I sort of slowly found people from Team Reality who also agreed with me on this. We talk a lot about the propaganda, the fact that it's sort of shocking that a lot of people who saw through government propaganda when it came from COVID can't see through Israeli government propaganda on this issue.
Well, it's not even just Israeli government propaganda, it's our own government,
It's
right?
our own government
There's like a direct line between what the Israeli government puts out and then what our government
That's right.
provides cover for and we're funding. And yeah, so I always say like your proximity to the government's position reveals if you're kind of like on the right side or the wrong side, or I don't want to say right or wrong side,
Yeah.
because that's not always, it's not 100% true all the time. But typically when the government is pushing something, right? We saw this in COVID. I remember people being like, I'll never trust the government
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
anything that they say. And then all of
Yeah.
a sudden it was like whatever the government's
Yeah.
narrative about what happened that day and how we have to respond,
Yeah.
the war on terror drums just started beating back up again.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it's apparent to me that a lot of people don't actually know very much, and they sort of just think, okay, it's Muslim people, it's kind of like 9/11, and it's kind of like Iran's mullahs, and so they're all bad, and that's such a naive and uninformed interpretation. And I don't mean to insult people, but you can also refrain from having an opinion if you don't know very much. Like I don't know very much about Russia, Ukraine, and I don't talk about it. I don't go on
That
and say
much.
you should blow up those Russians. Like, I
Right.
wouldn't say that anyway, but
Yeah, and I think also just sometimes people try to deflect and they'll be like, "Well, you don't really care about the massacres that are going on in Sudan, or you don't care about what's happening there." And I'm like, "Well, I do, but also our media isn't putting it in our face 24/7, putting
right,
out all these talking points, and also our government is funding a lot of different places all over the world, way
yeah.
more than I want, but there's nowhere, well, I guess Ukraine might have passed them in funding in these past couple of years, but historically, there's no one who has received more funding than Israel.
No, and we veto like resolutions against Israel's actions at the UN. I mean, imagine if we vetoed like I don't know, what's an example of a repressive regime? Like,
Yeah,
you know, we go
Iran,
around vetoing
China,
yeah, exactly. Resolutions against the massacre of the
the
what is
Uyghurs.
Uyghurs? Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I think it would be reasonable for people to say, "Wait a second, why are we vetoing this?" Um, so we give them a lot of money, we veto things, and as you say, it's in our face 24/7 that the people who are victims of the current moment, not
yeah.
not always, but are somehow the perpetrators and deserve to die. I think it's reasonable for us to start asking some questions.
And I know a lot of focus has been on what's happening in Gaza. Do you still have family in the West Bank? Can you speak at all to what has been happening in the West Bank since 10/7?
I do have family in the West Bank, quite a few. My dad has 9 siblings. Most live in the West Bank. A couple live in Jordan. As I said, they were never able to come back. Um, and I have quite a few cousins because they all have a lot of kids, and some of them already have some of my cousins have grandkids. But in any event, I mean, I don't talk to them directly. I don't actually speak Arabic, and most of them do not like speak English or very easily. So I'm not really in touch with them. I hear through my dad. It's chaotic. I don't know of any specific stories of anyone being hurt. But it's difficult. I mean, they're under kind of lockdown. It's hard. But my dad was saying they can't go to. My cousin had to cancel her wedding because she couldn't go to the next village to go get married where her fiance was because they are under such restricted movement.
Yeah, since that's what I've been hearing too, and been seeing from reporting that since the onslaught in Gaza began, also things have grown more intense in the West Bank, like on the movement of people, but also with the Israeli settlers that are all scattered throughout the West Bank. They've become more aggressive in their activities, which often include stealing land and taking over land, more and more
Yeah,
areas from Palestinians. And
yeah,
I think that's been very underreported. And also, um, I don't know, Americans seem to want to separate the two. They're like, yes, I don't like what's going on in the West Bank, but Gaza is different.
yeah, yeah. Because they
Um,
elected Hamas
right.
20 years ago.
So, so now we have d recently, I mean, there's been protests happening over the past 7 months, um, but recently in the past 2 weeks, there's been an explosion on college campuses of these encampments, and they are meant to represent the Gazans who've been displaced and are I think the majority of the population is in Rafah, but now they're starting to have a campaign perhaps in Rafah. So I'm not sure how people are being moved around, but almost all 2 million of the people were in Rafah, this small space, setting up camps. And so college students I guess their main thing was calling for their universities to divest from the military industrial complex and their investment in anything that has to do with the Israeli army or military. And then also just more generally calling for a ceasefire.
Yeah.
And this has evoked a very strong reaction. I mean, at first they were very peaceful protests from everything that I could see, and then it doesn't really seem until like the police came to shut them down, that's when most of the violence started. So can you just talk about, especially from a civil liberties perspective, and having done so much good work around the First Amendment, I mean, that's like one of your big cases was like the censorship regime during COVID. So, can you use that expertise you have to talk a little bit about what we saw here and what is within the First Amendment, what isn't within the First Amendment, and your perspective on the government's response?
Yeah, so the First Amendment protects most speech with some exceptions, like defamation, true threats. So that's like something very direct, like Jill, go kill Jack, not something like Jill, don't get the vaccine because you might, you might get COVID and die, which the government claimed was essentially the same thing. So we're talking about really trying to get, or especially if you were saying something that was untrue to get someone to do something violent, that would be another thing that's probably not protected. But other than those sort of narrow categories, basically all speech is protected. That includes offensive speech, that includes hate speech, so-called hate speech. And the reason for that is because we've seen throughout history, we're seeing now that it's very difficult to draw these lines. What is hate speech to somebody might not be hate speech to another, and we don't really want to put the government in charge of making these decisions. Rather, we assume that adults can sort these things out, can discuss them, and also cannot fall apart because someone says something that offends them.
Which
However,
was a big thing that people were shrieking about these past few years is
yeah,
like, oh, these college kids, they're snowflakes. They don't want to hear mean words. And now it seems as soon as somebody says something that's critical of, usually it's of the Israeli government,
yeah,
right? Not always. There are some things that might be directed towards Jews specifically, but still that seems to fall within free speech.
I mean, nothing could be more within free speech than criticism of governments. That's more or less was what the First Amendment was designed for. But, and you have these ambiguous phrases like from the river to the sea. So some of the people in our groups have said, oh, that is a call to kill all the Jews, because what else could it mean? It means, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That means killing all the Jews and replacing with Palestinians. I genuinely don't think anybody I know who says that means that. Perhaps some Hamas people mean that, but I think most people that I know mean, I'm not saying I agree with this, but mean that there should be no sort of Jewish Israeli state. Rather, it should be one state for all the people there, whether they're Jewish or not, and everyone should be free. In fact, I've asked people what they meant when they say that, and that's what they say they mean.
Right, like a one state solution.
Yeah, exactly. You may not agree with it, but to say, well, that just means that's a call for genocide, therefore nobody can say that, I think is completely crazy. It's the kind of thing we argued against during COVID, that you can't take an ambiguous phrase or idea and say, well, that could kill people if they act on it and if they interpret it this way. Therefore, it should be prohibited. I mean, I think that's totally crazy. And some of our friends have argued that you shouldn't be able to call for the abolition of a Jewish-only state, which again, I'm not saying that's my position. It's not. But to say people can't express that view, that it would be, some people think it would be better if we didn't have a Jewish state, because that by necessity means some people are in an inferior position. So that's something we should be able to discuss in a civilized society. So that said, I mean, clearly some of what's going on in campus isn't protected. And I'll say this again with the caveat that I don't feel like I have a very good understanding of what's happening. And that's for two reasons. Three reasons. I haven't been to any of the college campuses, so I haven't seen it with my own eyes. There are a lot of reports. I don't necessarily accept all those reports because there seems to be a motivation to paint the protesters as violent in order to discredit them. So, there's this hysterical report of a girl who was stabbed in the eye with a Palestinian flag at Yale. Well, it turned out she didn't suffer any serious injury in any way. From the video, it appears it was an accident. So I'm a little skeptical of some of these claims, which I think are designed to just discredit the protesters. That said, there's clearly been a lot of conduct that's not First Amendment protected, smashing windows, trespassing, that kind of thing are not, and that can be dealt with the existing laws. We don't need to enact new laws to deal with this.
And yeah, I mean, clearly the framing of the peaceful protests and a lot of these phrases as anti-Semitic is being used as a buzzsaw to cut off the conversation in the same way that cries of racism were being used to prevent us from having a real conversation about what was going on during the BLM protests and riots.
Right. 100%. It's a very good analogy.
And so the most recent development of what's going on, because I'm not on the campuses either, so it's definitely hard to say. I am actually going to go down into the city on Monday and see what's going on. Who knows what the situation will be like there, but New York City has a number of campuses that have been demonstrating. And so I anticipate that there will be something to go see for myself. But I know just from my own, I've been to dozens of protests, rallies, direct action, civil disobedience, right? I've done sit-ins. And there's always people who you're like not too keen on being part of your group, right? And you're like, hey, you're not making us look good. But then also when you have protesters and counter protesters, there's intense times and you can film things and frame things and then put them on the internet that are that are for your narrative, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not there,
Yeah.
then it's really hard to know. I know, like, when we did a sit-in one time, it was a whole group of us, right? But the way that the story was, it was like me and my son were at this restaurant and the police came to kick us out.
Oh yeah.
Well, right? It was really a
Yeah.
whole group of people there, and there was other people that got arrested, but because the police came in and the first table that they went to was the table where, like, my son and my friend and her daughter and we were,
Yeah.
that and I thought it really highlighted an important issue, but most people just thought it was, like, me and my son and my friend and her daughter.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
didn't understand that there was so much more context to what was going on.
Yeah, that's why somebody got, upset with me on Twitter the other day because I said I feel like I don't have a good grasp. There are videos, there are videos. I'm like, yeah, I've watched the videos. They're like, it's not really clear to me what the context is. There's that kid trying to get in. They're saying some people are saying they're not letting Jewish students in. I mean, I have a little trouble believing that, given that I know a lot of the protesters are Jewish themselves. I
Right.
find it a little hard to believe they're saying you can't come in because you're Jewish.
Right, but then there's other places where it's like, if you have a protest and a counter protest,
Right.
you typically don't let the counter protesters in your area, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
that
Right.
causes I think too, like, some people just don't have, like, a good understanding of some of the dynamics that are just naturally in play in these
Right. And
circumstances.
I mean, there's just such a concerted effort to discredit them. So, which is
Right,
not to say I approve of all of the behavior. I don't. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands across the country involved in this. Of course, I'm not going to agree with every single
right.
thing they all say or do. Another thing that keeps being said to discredit them is they don't know anything. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the history. You don't have to know the history. We can go in a back and forth about how Arafat should have accepted some offer or whatever. But the fact is that the children, people, innocent people who are around today, they don't deserve to live under an occupation. That shouldn't be permitted in a Western democratic society. And they shouldn't be killed for nothing more than the ethnic group they belong to.
But I also think it's just the sign of an effective movement, right? An effective movement is one that can gain broad support from the most amount of people, and it can just get people who are like, "Hey, I wanna come out for this thing. I might not know a lot about it, but I do know that this is right or wrong," and I felt like that's what we were never able to gain in the COVID stuff,
Yeah,
when we were against open schools and all of that, and I've done various political things, and my metric for success is always like, can I get people to come out because it's kind of like the cool thing to do, right?
yeah,
Because they want to be there because they see this movement is doing something good. And you don't like that's how a good piece of technology works, right? It's that
yeah,
it can connect you to the internet. You don't have to know how the internet works. You don't
yeah,
have to know how the things inside the computer works, but I can press the on button, I can go online, and that to me is the sign of a successful political movement.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the issues, right? I mean, so one reason I feel so passionately about this, and I tweeted a little bit, is I love my father, like most people, and I saw how much pain he was in. I mean, for as long as I can remember, I mean, he was traumatized by the treatment he endured under the occupation, and that his family endured. And then on to add insult to injury, he wasn't really able to talk about it. He's a professor at Cornell. He's getting closer to retirement, so he said he doesn't care now. So I think he's okay if I say these things. But he was terrified he was going to lose his job if he spoke openly. Lots of his colleagues were very pro-Israel, and he was tormented by it. Like I saw the moral conflict that he suffered. Like he wanted to be here, have a better life, have his kids have a better life, but on the other hand, he felt like he was betraying his people by not using the opportunity to talk about it and tell people what was going on. And like my dad is the nicest man in the world. He's so kind and like gentle and smart. And it pained me to see that growing up. And now when I see a lot of people, I'm not going to name names, but who don't really know what's going on, and they just think this is like a woke cause, and so we should be against it because we don't like wokeism. And I'm like, you have no idea. There's like for decades, you simply could not take the position. This is totally new that you can openly advocate for the Palestinian people.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, you're using your voice in the way that you are. I've certainly felt the pressure, and I'm Jewish.
Yeah,
I feel like I have the protection in a way of my identity of saying I grew up loving Israel. I grew up the first place I left when I left the country, my parents were like, "Oh, you have to go to Israel." Like my first Google search was gold in my ear.
yeah,
You know, so I feel like in a way I have a little bit of protection, and I can other people who don't, I can see how it's just that much harder.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of fear with that, but I want to be clear. I don't have a problem with Israel's existence. I don't have a problem with Israel's. I'm sure there are very nice things about it. I haven't been there since I was 13 because they gave my family too much trouble at the airport, so I don't want to deal with
Mm.
that again. We had to wait forever and ever. And they one time my dad took another trip maybe 15 years ago, and they wouldn't let him into the country. We don't know why still, but they sent him back. So I'm too
Yeah,
nervous.
well, I went to Palestine, and when
Yeah.
I came back into Israel and tried to leave the country, I was pulled out. And
Wow.
I didn't even show anybody my ID. I was waiting because it was 2009, so there's no smartphones. I
Yeah.
had to get my ticket printed out. I'm waiting in line in a crowd of people, and I was pulled out, and I was questioned for hours and hours. They had to hold my flight, and they finally decided to let me go. So I can only imagine if
Yeah.
I had a different identity.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I would love to go visit, and I have no problem with it existing, but I do have a problem with denying millions of people basic
Basic
civil rights.
Yeah. And so that brings us to the bill, HR 6090.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
It just passed the House, and it's called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And it says to provide for the consideration of a definition of anti-Semitism set forth by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for the enforcement of federal anti-discrimination laws concerning education programs or activities and for other purposes. And I'm trying to understand what this really means. I mean, of course, there's like the broader context of we're in the middle of this national conversation.
Yeah.
And I mean, our government is clearly has favoritism towards Israel. And then I would say by extension, Jewish people. And then, they deny it, but then they come out with this law that seems to give a special definition to anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And so you're a civil rights attorney, and I thought maybe you could help us understand it a little bit better. Should we go through some of the ways that it defines anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I think that's the most important component. So just to be clear, because I've seen a few misconceptions on Twitter, this does not criminalize anti-Semitic speech as defined here, which I don't agree that that's a correct definition of anti-Semitism, but it doesn't criminalize it, but it allows the Department of Education to withhold funds from universities that don't enforce this code of conduct or code of speech. So if the university doesn't punish students for saying these types of things, then the Department of Education can withhold funds, and that's usually a big deal. That usually means that the universities adopt the policies.
Right. So they say things like calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of radical ideology, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews. And by that, they mean the myth about world Jewish conspiracy, Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. I mean, this law doesn't really do them much favors in that regard. Um, accusing Jews as people of being responsible or real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group for even acts committed by non-Jews. Accusing Jews or Israel of inventing the Holocaust, accusing a Jewish citizen of being more loyal to Israel, like basically having dual loyalty, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of
That's
any other
perhaps the
democratic
most
nation.
ridiculous one. I mean, uh, that's clearly designed so when you say Israel is in violation of international law because it keeps the Palestinians under an occupation, so they can say, well, country X also keeps it under an occupation, and you're not saying that, so therefore you're anti-Semitic. I mean, to consider that anti-Semitic speech is ridiculous. And by the way, almost everything we've seen there, if not everything, is protected speech. A lot of it's not nice. I don't advocate people saying that. It's offensive, some of it, not all of it.
They do say in the text of the bill, right? In the text of the bill, they don't tell you the definition of anti-Semitism. They
Yeah,
tell you to go to that
yeah.
organization's website to figure it out. They do say none of this should be construed as denying people their First Amendment rights. And so that's what I'm
But
trying to
what does that even
understand.
mean? That's
Yeah,
like a nicety. I mean,
that was like
because
when they said in COVID when that the vaccine passports, right? That
yeah,
they couldn't deny you, they couldn't discriminate against you,
yeah,
right? And yet when you said, "Hey, I have a religious exemption, I have a medical
yeah.
exemption," they'd be like, "Oh, sorry, we're just not going to serve you anyways."
Yeah, it's like saying, passing a law saying you can't criticize the government, but we're not violating your First Amendment rights. I mean, what does that mean? It's
Right.
ridiculous.
And so
Uh,
I'm trying to understand, would it be that if a student says one of these things, the university would be expected to punish them? Would it
yeah.
be like you can't read certain, like if you're taking a course on the Arab-Israeli conflict, would you not be allowed to read a book that, shows an opinion that's critical of Israel?
So I'm guessing something like that would probably not actually be subject to the disciplinary processes, but one of the points of something like this is to chill because it's so unclear. and it seems to catch up so much dialogue that a lot of professors might be like, you know what, I don't want to get in trouble. I'm just not going to assign that book. And I'm not going to risk it by assigning that book. And so then you cut off dialogue about it. In fact, a lot of professors might say, you know what, I'm not going to teach a class on the Palestine-Israel conflict because something could be construed as anti-Semitic. So it has an extreme chilling effect, which is one of our major concerns under the First Amendment, is that even if the law isn't designed to or intended to or won't punish certain kinds of behavior, if it's vague and people think it will, that it's problematic.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand why this would even be necessary. Like, we have an extensive amount of laws, obviously making things that are not speech, right? Like
Yeah.
actual violence and harassment, which I guess harassment can be speech, right? If you're just like following somebody around
Yeah.
and stuff.
But there's still, you're kind of punishing the conduct. If you just say something once, it's probably not going to be harassment. If you're following them home and
right.
saying over and
Just
over, it's
following
almost
them,
like
yeah.
yeah.
So those things are clearly illegal. And we already have a whole slew of anti-discrimination law that I I believe covers your religious views.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
exactly.
is
Well,
there really a need for this, or like
of course
what's going
not.
on
I
here?
mean, and well, what's going on is just these are politicians who want to pander to their constituents. And they just want to prove that they're going to be tough on this anti-Semitism on campuses. I think most of them know it's probably not going to pass judicial scrutiny. I mean, it's probably not even going to pass through the Senate,
Okay.
honestly. But
I mean, it seems like a pretty big margin in the House. I don't have it off the top, but I think it was like 90 against it, and then all
yeah,
the rest
90 and
for.
then like 300 something for. It was an interesting coalition to get. I read all the nays. So you have Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC were nays. Some of the Christian right is upset about it because included in the definition of anti-Semitism is saying that the Jews killed Jesus, which is sort of part of the Bible. So I think, yeah, some Christian right people don't like it for that reason.
Okay. And so, but you think that in the Senate, it hopefully has less staying power.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Senate is smarter than the House,
Okay.
just to be kind of blunt about it. I mean, the senators tend to be a little bit more qualified. Not with, I mean, there are exceptions. There are a number of people in the House I like quite a bit. Most of them voted nay on this bill, but I think the Senate is. Yeah, and I mean, they don't want to waste taxpayer money litigating this. The minute the president signed it, there would be 50 lawsuits. Like it's.
And now this is a big year. We're coming up
Yeah.
to an election year. Obviously, this war has been going on for 7 months now. Do you have any predictions for what we can see? Any hopes? Any expectations?
Hopes? No, because all the options suck. I'm not a fan of Trump. I'm not a fan of Biden. I'm not a fan of RFK, certainly not given his views on Israel. There's at this point, I'm kind of checked out, honestly. I used to be very sort of active certainly when it came to like presidential elections, but I don't care anymore. How about you? What do you think?
Well, I certainly don't think, everybody's saying FJB. I guess we all, apparently there was a video, right, of
Yeah,
protesters on both sides broke
yeah,
out into that chant. But it's sort of like a lot of people are boosting that as being like, well, I guess Trump's going to win. But I'm like, we should probably apply some scrutiny to Trump's policy and what would be on this. Because if I recall, he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to
yeah,
Jerusalem, which was something that intensified the situation. And then he did the Abraham Accords,
yeah,
which if you weren't really paying attention, you'd be like, oh, that's probably a good thing. Like, nobody ever thought of this other way to try to create peace in the Middle East. But really what he was doing was trying to cut the Palestinians out,
yeah,
right? We're just going to go around and we're going to make deals with everybody else, and we're going to leave the Palestinians to rot in occupation for, however long.
yeah,
And he made a comment one time, I guess, being like, oh, they got to wrap up this war. But more recently, he's said, Joe Biden's not been tough enough. He's not
yeah,
given Israel enough support. So I'm not convinced his policy would be really any different. I'm not, I haven't been paying attention to the presidential stuff too much. I'm very cued in on local politics and creating local, even just outside of politics, local networks. And, I homeschool my son. So creating that community is really important to me. And I do think that as space has gotten between us and what's happened in COVID, of course, it hasn't been as uh, the reckoning hasn't been as, what I would have liked to see. But I do think
Yeah,
we've been able to have a more honest conversation about what happened during COVID. Are there still
yeah,
zealots out there? Sure. But most people have admitted that the school closures were wrong, that
yeah,
the masking was wrong, that even there's stuff coming out about the side effects
yeah,
of the shot now. So I have to remain optimistic that people like you and I and will use our voice, and hopefully it moves the conversation. I hope we're not just creating more contention. But I'm hopeful that as we get space between this conflict and this time, that we can have a more honest conversation.
yeah, yeah. I hope so too.
So where can people find you, follow your work?
So I would say mainly Twitter. I'm at Jenin JeninYounesEsq Esquire. Um, I don't know why I have the Esquire. I think Jenin Younes was taken by me. I had like an earlier account that I locked a long time ago. But and then I work at the New Civil Liberties Alliance. That's the website is nclalegal.org.
And you do a lot of great work over there. I highly encourage people to check it out. It's so important in this day and age that we have our free speech, we have our civil liberties, and we speak out on them. And you're doing exactly that. So thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for everything you're doing. And congratulations on being a new mother. It's
Oh, thank you.
beautiful. It's amazing,
Yeah, it is.
and you're a great mother. I can
Oh,
tell.
thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this very important conversation. First of all, make sure that you are following Jenin. I have her Twitter linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are. And of course, make sure you've hit that like button and you're subscribed to the channel. Also, I'd appreciate it if you could share this one out with your friends. I think that it's such an important conversation. And as I said in the beginning, most Americans have not been exposed to the Palestinian perspective. Most of us have Jewish friends, and we get exposed to that perspective in the media. But most of us don't know a Palestinian and have never had the opportunity to hear them speak. So share this out, and thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, think free, live free, and give all the glory to God.
Come on.